Deep in the dark hours of a June morning in 1982, a Boeing 727 came sweeping down toward the coast of northeastern Brazil, its captain's eyes fixed on the glittering lights of the city ahead. He had been cleared to level off at 5,000 feet. Instead, the aeroplane sank straight through 5,000 feet and kept going down. A warning horn sounded in the cockpit, telling him the ground was rising to meet him. He pressed on. The horn sounded again. His own first officer spoke up, warning him about the mountains ahead. And still the captain flew downward, drawn toward those city lights, like a moth to a flame, until the aircraft, perfectly healthy, its crew fully warned, flew into the side of a wooded mountain at more than 300 miles an hour, killing all 137 people aboard. This is not the story of a machine that failed or of a crew taken by surprise. It is the far more unsettling story of a disaster that announced itself loudly and repeatedly to men who did not or could not heed it. This is VASP Flight 168. On the 8th of June, 1982, a Boeing 727 operated by the Brazilian airline VASP flew into a mountainside while descending toward Fortaleza on the country's northeastern coast, killing everyone on board. It remains to this day the deadliest aviation accident to befall a Brazilian aircraft in the entire 20th century, and the third deadliest in the nation's history by any measure. What makes it so haunting is not the scale of the loss alone, but the way it happened. This was not a sudden, unforeseeable catastrophe. There was no engine tearing itself apart, no fire, no structural failure, no bomb. The aeroplane was working perfectly. The weather, though dark, was not the primary culprit. And in the final minutes, the aircraft's own instruments warned the crew, not once, but twice, that they were flying into the ground, and the first officer added his own voice to those warnings. And yet the descent continued, smooth and deliberate, all the way into the mountain. To understand how that can happen, how a competent captain can fly a functioning aeroplane into terrain while being told repeatedly that he is doing exactly that, we have to understand one of the most insidious enemies a pilot can ever face. Not a failure of the machine, but a failure of his own perception. The airline at the heart of this story was one of Brazil's great aviation institutions. VASP, the name stood for Viação Aérea São Paulo, had been founded in 1933 and was, for much of the 20th century, one of the country's largest and most important carriers, owned for many years by the state government of São Paulo. It flew the length and breadth of a vast nation, connecting the great cities of the industrial South with the far-flung cities of the North and Northeast, and by the early 1980s its fleet included the Boeing 727, the three-engined American jet that had become one of the most ubiquitous airliners in the world. It was a workhorse of domestic aviation across the Americas, and VASP used its 727s exactly as intended, to move large numbers of people quickly across the enormous distances that define Brazilian geography. The particular aircraft that would operate Flight 168 was a Boeing 727-200, registered Papa Sierra Romeo Kilo. It was not a new aeroplane, but neither was it old. It was about 5 years into its service life, having first flown for Singapore Airlines between 1977 and 1980, before making its way to Brazil and into the VASP fleet. It was, by every account, a thoroughly sound and well-maintained aircraft, with no mechanical issues that would play any part in what was to come. Whatever brought Papa Sierra Romeo Kilo down on that June night, it was not the aeroplane itself. The machine did everything it was asked to do, right up to and including sounding the alarm that should have saved everyone aboard. To appreciate the weight this accident carries, it helps to understand the moment Brazilian aviation was living through in 1982. The country was in the midst of a long expansion of air travel, knitting together a continent-sized nation whose great population centers are separated by vast distances of forest, mountain, and coast, distances that make flying not a luxury, but a necessity of national life. Airlines like VASP, Varig, and others were the arteries of that connection, and the Boeing 727 was one of the workhorses that made it possible. A rugged and capable jet, well suited to the mix of major hubs and challenging regional airports that Brazilian geography demanded. But rapid growth in air travel brings with it an unforgiving arithmetic. More flights, more approaches into more airports, many of them ringed by difficult terrain and served at night, mean more opportunities for the kind of human error that Flight 168 would come to embody. The accident struck at a time when the tools and the culture for managing that risk, the terrain warning technology, the cockpit discipline, the crew training, were still maturing in Brazil as everywhere else. In that sense, Flight 168 was not only a Brazilian tragedy, but a marker of an era, one of the accidents through which the whole world was, painfully, learning the lessons that would eventually make the skies far safer. Flight 168 was a scheduled domestic service that threaded together three of Brazil's major cities. It began in São Paulo, the sprawling industrial heart of the country in the south, made an intermediate stop at Rio de Janeiro, and was then to continue northeast, up the long curve of the Brazilian coast to its final destination at Fortaleza, a major city on the northeastern shoulder of the continent. The first leg from São Paulo to Rio de Janeiro was completed entirely without incident, an ordinary hop between the country's two largest cities. Then, at Rio, the aircraft took on its final complement of passengers and crew and departed on the long overnight leg north to Fortaleza. In total, 137 people were aboard, 128 passengers and 9 crew. The crew that would fly that final leg were, on paper, an experienced group. In command was Captain Fernando Antonio Vieira de Paiva, 43 years old, a seasoned aviator with more than 15,000 hours of flying time behind him, a veteran by any standard. In the right-hand seat was the first officer, Carlos Roberto Duarte Barbosa, 28, considerably younger but himself no novice, with over 5,000 hours logged. The third member of the flight deck crew was the flight engineer, José Aramar de Freitas, 31, who had been with VASP since 1971 as an aircraft engineer but had only qualified as a flight engineer in 1979, and had accumulated just 279 hours in that role. It was, in other words, a flight deck led by a very experienced captain, supported by a capable first officer and a relatively junior engineer, a fairly ordinary distribution of experience for an airline crew of the era. And that ordinariness matters, because nothing about this crew's credentials hinted at the catastrophe to come. The problem that would destroy Flight 168 was not a lack of hours or a lack of skill. It was something that can reach even the most experienced pilot, in the right conditions, on the wrong night. Among the 128 passengers settling into their seats, that night was a man whose presence lends the tragedy an additional, almost unbearable note of chance. Edson Queiroz was one of Brazil's most prominent businessmen, the head of a sprawling industrial conglomerate that bore his name, and that had helped drive a nationwide transformation in how ordinary Brazilians cooked, pioneering the country's shift away from wood-burning stoves toward modern gas. He was a figure of real national significance, a titan of Brazilian industry, and he was not originally supposed to be on Flight 168 at all. Queiroz had bought a ticket for a different airline's flight the following morning, but he had an early meeting to make in Fortaleza, and he grew uncertain that the morning flight would land in time to get him there. So, shortly before departure, he made a small, fateful decision of the kind that fills the histories of air disasters. He exchanged his ticket, gave up his seat on the later flight, and boarded VASP 168 instead, to be sure of arriving on time. It is one of those details that haunts a story like this, the reminder that an aeroplane full of people is an aeroplane full of individual choices, each one leading, unknowingly, to the same dark mountainside. Some had planned to be on that flight for weeks. At least one had decided only minutes before the doors closed. To understand what happened in the cockpit of Flight 168, we have to talk about the single most treacherous condition in all of flying, a phenomenon that has killed more pilots than almost any mechanical failure ever devised. It is called spatial disorientation, and its danger lies in the fact that it turns a pilot's own senses against him. Human beings did not evolve to fly. We evolved to move about on the ground, and our sense of balance and orientation, the system that tells us which way is up, whether we are turning, whether we are climbing or descending, is built for that world. It relies on a combination of what our eyes see, what the fluid in the balance organs of our inner ears detects, and the pressures and sensations felt throughout the body. On the ground in daylight, these systems work together seamlessly and reliably. But in an aircraft, especially at night or in cloud, they can be catastrophically fooled. The inner ear, in particular, is easily deceived. A gentle, sustained turn can come to feel like straight flight, and a return to level can feel like a turn in the opposite direction. Without a clear external reference, a visible horizon, the lights of the ground laid out in their proper place, a pilot's physical sensations can tell him, with complete conviction, that the aeroplane is doing something entirely different from what it is actually doing. This is why instrument flying exists, and why it must be trained and trusted. Because when you cannot see outside, the only reliable truth about the aircraft's attitude and altitude is on the instruments, and your own body will lie to you. It is worth being precise about the particular illusions that night flying can produce, because they are more varied and more specific than a simple failure to see. Pilots and researchers have cataloged a whole family of visual traps that arise when the normal, rich landscape of daytime cues is stripped away. There is the well-known black hole approach, in which an aircraft flying toward a runway across a stretch of featureless darkness, over water, or unlit terrain loses the visual references that tell a pilot how high he is, and can descend far too low without alarm. But there are others, subtler and in some ways more dangerous. Sloping or uneven terrain beneath the flight path can create a false impression of the aircraft's height and angle. A brightly lit area beyond a dark foreground can make the aircraft seem higher, or further from the ground, than it truly is, and a concentrated, brilliant field of light ahead, a city on the coast, blazing against the black, can exert a kind of visual and even psychological pull, drawing the pilot's gaze and his aircraft toward it while the unlit ground in between, which his eyes are no longer scanning, vanishes from his awareness entirely. What all of these illusions share is that they do not feel like confusion, they feel like clarity. The disoriented pilot is not aware that he is disoriented. On the contrary, he often feels entirely confident that he knows where he is and what the aircraft is doing. That false confidence is precisely what makes the condition so lethal, and it is why the discipline of trusting the instruments over the senses has to be drilled so deeply that it can override the powerful, convincing testimony of a pilot's own eyes. Now place that vulnerability into the specific situation of Flight 168, descending toward Fortaleza in the dark. The aircraft was approaching the city at night, and ahead of it, spread out across the coast, lay the lights of Fortaleza, a glittering, sprawling field of light in an otherwise black landscape. And herein lay a subtle and deadly trap, one distinct from the simple darkness that claims so many night flights. The problem was not an absence of visual cues, but the presence of the wrong ones. A brilliant, seductive field of city lights ahead can act as a kind of false horizon, pulling the eye and drawing the aircraft toward it. A pilot fixated on those lights, flying toward them, can lose his sense of the aircraft's true attitude, and, crucially, his sense of how the terrain between him and the city is arranged. The lights of Fortaleza sat on the coast, but between the descending aeroplane and that coast rose ground, hills and mountains, dark and invisible against the night, utterly outshone by the brilliance of the city beyond them. To an eye locked onto the glittering prize of the city, the black bulk of a mountain in the foreground could simply cease to register. The captain, the investigation would later conclude, was very probably disoriented by those bright lights ahead, his perception captured by the city, his awareness of the rising dark terrain in between dangerously diminished. This is fixation, the same fatal narrowing of attention that recurs again and again in the annals of air disasters, the mind seizing on a single compelling object and filtering out everything else, including mortal danger. And in the case of Flight 168, the object was the most natural thing in the world for a tired pilot at the end of a long night flight to fix upon. The lights of the city where he was about to land, the promised end of the journey, glittering invitingly through the darkness ahead. As Flight 168 approached Fortaleza, air traffic control cleared it to descend from its cruising altitude, flight level 330, approximately 33,000 feet above sea level, down to 5,000 feet. This was an entirely normal instruction. 5,000 feet was a safe intermediate altitude, comfortably above the terrain in the area, from which the aircraft would continue toward its final approach to the airport. The crew began their descent, bringing the big three-engine jet smoothly down through the night sky toward the waiting city, down through the 30s, down through the 20s, down through the teens, The aeroplane descended at a steady, ordinary rate, exactly as it was supposed to. And then it reached 5,000 feet, the altitude at which it had been told to stop. It did not stop. Instead, the aircraft continued its descent, sinking straight through the 5,000-foot clearance limit as though it had never been given, and kept going down, toward the dark, rising terrain that lay between it and the glittering coast. There was no dramatic plunge, no steepening dive. The aeroplane simply carried on descending at its steady rate, smoothly and deliberately, past the altitude that was supposed to keep it safe, guided by a captain whose eyes and mind in all likelihood were locked on the lights ahead and no longer accurately registering how low the aircraft had sunk or what lay in its path. And here is where the story of Flight 168 diverges, in the most agonizing way, from a simple tale of a crew flying blindly to their deaths. Because they were not blind, they were warned. The Boeing 727 was equipped with a ground proximity warning system, the GPS, a device designed for exactly this scenario. Its entire purpose is to detect when an aircraft is getting dangerously close to the terrain and to alert the crew in time for them to climb away. And on Flight 168, the system did its job. As the aeroplane descended toward the rising ground, the ground proximity warning system activated, sounding its alarm in the cockpit, a clear, unambiguous warning that the terrain was coming up, that the aircraft was too low, that the crew needed to act. It was the machine reaching out to save the men flying it. The warning was not heeded. The descent continued, and so the system warned them again. A second time, the alarm sounding once more into the cockpit, insisting that the ground was rising to meet them. Twice, the aircraft's own instruments told the crew, in the plainest terms available to a machine, that they were about to fly into the earth. And it was not only the machine. The first officer, Carlos Barbosa, in the right-hand seat, also recognized the danger and spoke up. He warned the captain about the terrain ahead, a human voice, added to the mechanical one, telling the man at the controls that they were flying toward the mountains. Here was every safeguard the situation could offer, functioning exactly as intended. An automated system detecting the danger and sounding the alarm twice, and a second qualified pilot perceiving the threat and vocalizing it. By every design of modern aviation safety, this should have been enough. The chain of warnings should have broken the captain's fixation, prompted an immediate climb, and saved the aircraft. It did not. The captain continued the descent. Whether because his disorientation was so complete that the warnings simply did not penetrate, or because the ingrained authority of a veteran captain in command led him to dismiss or override the alarms and his junior colleagues' concern, the aeroplane kept going down. The warnings sounded and were not acted upon. The first officer spoke and was not heeded, and the glittering lights of Fortaleza drew the aircraft onward and downward toward the black mountain that stood, unseen, directly in its path. At an altitude of approximately 2,500 feet, still descending, still under power, still with its crew apparently believing they were somewhere they could safely be, VASP Flight 168 flew directly into the wooded slope of a mountain in the Serra de Aratanja, a range of hills near the town of Pacatuba, roughly 20 kilometers to the southwest of Fortaleza Airport. The impact, at the aircraft's substantial approach speed, was instantaneous and total. The Boeing 727 disintegrated against the mountainside, scattering wreckage across a wide swath of the dark forest, and the aircraft's remaining fuel ignited into a fire that would burn among the trees for hours. There were no survivors. All 137 people aboard, the 128 passengers, including the industrialist Edson Queiroz, who had changed his ticket only hours before, and the 9 crew, were killed in an instant, on a mountainside they very likely never saw. The crash happened in a remote and rugged place, and that remoteness shaped everything about the response. The mountainside where Flight 168 came down was densely wooded and difficult to reach, far from any road, and in the darkness the scale of what had happened was not immediately clear. Local residents in the area heard the impact, a loud explosion rolling out of the night, and saw flames lighting up the sky above the forested slopes, and it was these alarms from people on the ground that first alerted the authorities that something terrible had occurred. Emergency services from Fortaleza mobilized and made their way toward the site, but the combination of distance, rough terrain, and the fire still burning among the trees meant that reaching the wreckage took time, and the difficulty of access would hamper the recovery effort for days. When rescuers did reach the scene, they found what the physics of the impact made inevitable. There was no one to save. The violence of a jetliner striking a mountainside at approach speed left no possibility of survival, and the subsequent fire had consumed much of what remained. In the days that followed, the grim work of recovery unfolded in that difficult terrain, with helicopters used to help reach the site and teams working amid the wreckage scattered across the forested slope. It was, by the standards of any era, a harrowing task, made all the more so by the technological limits of 1982, a time before the forensic tools that would later become standard, when the work of accounting for the dead had to rely on older and more painstaking methods. In the end, many of those aboard could not be individually identified, and the victims were laid to rest together in a collective grave in Fortaleza, a single resting place for the many who had come down together on that mountain. It is a detail that speaks, more than any statistic, to the totality of the loss. The task of determining what had brought Flight 168 down fell to the Brazilian Air Accident Investigation Authorities, working to reconstruct the aircraft's final flight from the physical evidence and, crucially, from the aircraft's recorders. And what the investigation found was, in its essentials, starkly clearer in some ways than many accidents, because the aircraft had left behind a record of its own destruction and of the warnings that had gone unheeded. The fundamental facts were not in serious doubt. The aeroplane had been mechanically sound. There was no failure of the aircraft or its engines that could account for the crash. The weather, while it was night, did not present conditions that should have defeated a competent crew flying on instruments. The aircraft had been given a clear and safe instruction to level off at 5,000 feet and had, for reasons rooted not in the machine but in the men, failed to comply, descending through that altitude and continuing down into the terrain. This was, in the language of accident investigation, a controlled flight into terrain, an entirely airworthy aircraft under the full control of its crew flown inadvertently into the ground. The aeroplane did not fail. It did exactly what it was told to do by the pilot at the controls, which was tragically to keep descending. The central question then was why an experienced captain had flown a functioning aircraft below his clearance and into a mountain. And here the investigation pointed to the phenomenon we began with, spatial disorientation, brought on, in all probability, by the bright lights of the city ahead. The captain, fixated on Fortaleza's lights and very likely disoriented by them, had continued the descent well below the safe altitude, his perception of the aircraft's situation dangerously detached from its reality. He believed, it seems, that he was in a position to continue down. He was not, and the tragedy is sharpened to an almost unbearable point by the fact, established beyond doubt from the recorders, that he had been told he was wrong, warned twice by the ground proximity warning system and warned again by his own first officer, and had continued anyway. It is worth dwelling on that last point, because it is the heart of what Flight 168 has to teach, and it reaches far beyond one cockpit on one night in Brazil. The accident was not, at its core, a failure of technology or training in the narrow sense. The technology worked. The ground proximity warning system detected the danger and sounded the alarm, precisely as designed. The second pilot worked too, in the sense that he perceived the threat and voiced it. Every link in the safety chain that was supposed to catch this kind of error actually functioned, and still the aircraft crashed, because none of those warnings succeeded in changing the actions of the one person whose hands were on the controls. This points to one of the most important and hardest problems in all of aviation human factors, a problem the industry was, in the early 1980s, only beginning to grapple with seriously. It is the question of what happens when the person in command is wrong, and everyone and everything around him is telling him so, and he does not listen. In a traditional cockpit culture, the captain's authority was close to absolute. The first officer's role was to assist and defer, not to challenge or override. Under that model, a junior pilot who saw his captain making a fatal mistake faced an almost impossible task: to somehow break through the authority of a senior commander with decades of experience, forcefully enough to change his course in the handful of seconds available. A single warning, tentatively offered, and then not repeated more forcefully, could too easily be lost. The mechanical warnings, similarly, were only as useful as the crew's willingness to believe them over the evidence of their own captain's conviction. Flight 168 is a stark illustration of the terrible cost of that dynamic, of a system in which the safeguards all functioned and were all, in the end, overridden by the fixed certainty of a single disoriented man. The broader lessons that would reshape aviation in the years that followed. The rigorous discipline of crew resource management, which trains first officers to escalate their concerns assertively and empowers them to take control when a captain is incapacitated by error, and the continual refinement of ground proximity warning systems and the procedures for responding to them without hesitation, are, in a sense, the collective answer of the aviation world to disasters exactly like this one. The idea that a warning must be acted upon immediately and without argument, that a first officer not only may but must intervene when the aircraft is in danger, that no captain's authority outranks the ground rushing up to meet the aeroplane. These hard-won principles are written, in part, in the memory of flights like 168, where the warnings came and were not enough. In the decades since Flight 168, the specific technology that failed to save it has been transformed. The ground proximity warning system of 1982 was a genuine advance, but it had real limitations, chief among them that it largely looked straight down, measuring the aircraft's height above the ground directly beneath it, which meant that terrain rising steeply ahead of the aircraft could give relatively little warning before it was too late. A jet descending toward a mountain could, in the worst cases, receive its alarm only seconds before impact. In the years that followed, this was addressed by the development of a far more capable successor, the Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System, which pairs the aircraft's position with a detailed digital map of the world's terrain, allowing it to see the mountains ahead long before the aircraft reaches them and to warn the crew with far more time to react. Had such a system been aboard Flight 168, it might well have sounded its alarm early enough and insistently enough to overcome even a disoriented captain's fixation. The relentless improvement of these systems, driven by accident after accident in which aircraft flew into terrain that a better warning might have revealed, is one of the great quiet success stories of aviation safety. Controlled flight into terrain accidents, once among the most common ways for airliners to be lost, have become dramatically rarer as a direct result. But technology was only ever half the answer, and arguably the lesser half. The deeper transformation was cultural, the slow, hard reworking of how a cockpit crew functions as a team. In the years around and after this accident, the global aviation industry increasingly embraced the principles of crew resource management, a discipline born precisely from the recognition that so many crashes were caused not by a lack of individual skill, but by failures of communication, of coordination, of the willingness of a crew to function as mutually correcting professionals, rather than as a commander and his subordinates. The core insight is simple and profound, that the safety of the aircraft must never depend on the infallibility of one person. A first officer must be trained and empowered to speak up, clearly and repeatedly, and, if necessary, to physically take control when the aircraft is in danger and the captain is not responding. Warnings from instruments or from other crew members must be treated as commands to act, not as suggestions to be weighed against a senior pilot's certainty. Flight 168, in which a captain's fixed and disoriented judgment overrode every warning available to him, is a textbook case of exactly the failure that crew resource management was designed to prevent. Behind the lessons and the systems and the investigative findings, though, there remain the people, the 137 human beings who boarded an ordinary flight home and never arrived. There was Edson Quiroz, the industrialist who had changed his ticket at the last moment to make a morning meeting, and who thereby traded a later flight for a place on this one. There were the crew, doing their jobs on a routine overnight service. And there were the more than 100 other passengers, each with their own reasons for being aboard, their own lives and families and plans, all of them extinguished together on a dark mountainside within sight of the city they were trying to reach. For the families left behind, the collective grave in Fortaleza became the focus of a collective grief, a single place to mourn a loss that had struck so many at once. in a country that would carry the memory of Flight 168 as one of the darkest days in its aviation history. There is a particular cruelty in the nature of this disaster that sets it apart from crashes caused by the sudden, unforeseeable failure of a machine. Those aboard Flight 168 were not doomed by some hidden flaw that no one could have caught in time. They were doomed by a failure of perception in a single mind, at a moment when the means to prevent the tragedy were all present and functioning. An alarm that sounded twice and a colleague who spoke up. The margin between disaster and salvation was not a missing piece of technology or an unknowable mechanical fault. It was the width of a warning that went unheeded, and that perhaps is the most haunting thing about it, that everything needed to save those 137 people existed, in that cockpit in those final minutes, everything except the one response that never came. VASP Flight 168 endures then as one of the most important and instructive accidents in the history of Brazilian aviation, and as a permanent monument to a truth that the whole industry would spend the following decades absorbing, that the deadliest dangers in flight are not always the ones that announce themselves as emergencies. Sometimes the aeroplane is working perfectly. Sometimes the weather is merely dark. Sometimes the enemy is not a broken machine, but the quiet, invisible failure of a human being's own perception, the pull of a beautiful field of lights, drawing a captain's eyes and mind away from the black mountain rising in the foreground, so completely that not even the alarm of his own aircraft, sounding twice, nor the voice of the man beside him, could break the spell in time. 137 people flew toward the lights of Fortaleza on the night of the 8th of June, 1982, believing they were nearly home. They were closer to the mountain than to the city, and the warnings that might have told them so and turned them away sounded into a cockpit that could no longer hear them.